It's talking about Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Judas when they'd returned from Jerusalem to give good news to the church in Antioch. So when they were sent off, they came to Antioch. And when they had gathered the multitude together, they delivered the letter. When they had read it, they rejoiced over its encouragement. Now Judas and Silas, themselves being prophets also, exhorted and strengthened the brethren with many words. And after they had stayed there for a time, they were sent back with greetings from the brethren to the apostles. However, it seemed good to Silas to remain there. Paul and Barnabas also remained in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord with many others also. Then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we've preached the word of the Lord, and see how they are doing." Now Barnabas was determined to take with them John called Mark. But Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Then the contention became so fierce, so sharp, that they parted from one another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Then he came to Derbe and Lystra. And behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted him to go on with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. And as they went through the cities, they delivered to them the decrees to keep, which were determined by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily. Amen. Again, Lord, we come to you and we ask for your help to understand and to apply this passage. Speak it into our hearts, we pray, that Jesus might have the preeminence. Amen. There's only one perfect person who's ever lived. Only one person who's never said anything wrong, never done anything with an ulterior motive, always acted with complete integrity. There's only one person who in every situation always got everything exactly right. There's only one person that's never been at fault in a disagreement or a falling out, and that is Jesus. There's only one person whose plans will always work out, whether we get things right or not. There's only one person whose plans will never, ever fail, but always succeed, and that is Jesus. Everyone else, all of us, have and will get things wrong, but Jesus never. And today in this passage we see something go wrong. But by his Spirit, Jesus still works. What happens in this passage doesn't derail God's plan, but actually by God's grace, not because of what happens, but by God's grace, God's plans are advanced. You've got Paul and Barnabas, two of the godliest men in the New Testament, and they fall out. And it's a big fallout, and it's a shock. Think of some of the greatest duos in history. You can't imagine one of them without the other, can you? Jonathan and David. Luther and Melanchthon. Ant and Dec. I read Bob Mortimer's autobiography on holiday. It was brilliant. He talks about his partnership with Vic Reeves. And for 40 years, they've worked together nearly every day. And he said, we've never had a cross word. There's certain names, aren't they? Vic and Bob and Ant and Dec and other names. You just can't imagine them without the other. Well, in New Testament terms, Paul and Barnabas. Inconceivable to have one without the other. They were the ultimate double act in the first part of the book of Acts. They've been the closest ministry partners for several years. It was Barnabas, if you remember, who vouched for Paul when the church in Jerusalem wasn't sure about him because they'd remembered him when he was effectively a terrorist. It was Barnabas who sent for Paul from Tarsus and ushered him into ministry when people were uncertain about him. Barnabas and Paul had stood together, they'd planted churches together, they'd been on mission trips together, they'd stuck their necks out for one another, they'd witnessed one another suffering. They were a dynamic duo. They got on well. They complemented one another's strengths. The gifts would have overlapped, but you've got the relational gifts of Barnabas and you've got the intellect of Paul, and you put them together and it's a powerful team. And yet in this passage they have a massive fallout. And although it does seem that there's some reconciliation, or it does seem that there's reconciliation eventually, this is the end of their partnership. That never recovers. In that sense, there's not a happy ending. And you think, well, how can that be good? Can it be good? Can God still work in that mess? How should we handle it when we fall out? Well, it helps us to remember two things. Only Jesus is perfect, and God's plans will work despite our mess. They're the two main things we take. Only Jesus is perfect, and God's plans will work despite our mess. So this is a challenging passage for us to look at. We want to do it sensitively, but we're going to look at the narrative, we're going to look at what's going on, and then we'll draw some lessons. We're going to see what's going on, we're going to see the flashpoint, what causes the falling out, then we'll see the fallout from the fallout, and then we'll see 4 lessons for us. So firstly, the narrative. Remember, we'll go verse 30 to 35. Remember the passage we looked at 2 weeks ago? It was all about unity. It was crucial that there wasn't a divide between let's call them the original Jewish Christians and the people who were becoming Christians from the non-Jewish community. It was essential that them two groups had unity, that them two groups became one group. Now, you can have 1 or 2 people not on board with things, but there must be general agreement, mustn't there, for there to be unity. And some of the original Jewish Christians were pressurizing the new non-Jewish Christians that to be a Christian, you didn't just have to trust in Jesus, but you had to keep certain laws. And those laws were kind of summarized by circumcision. What they were saying is, for you to become a Christian, you've got to effectively also become Jewish. It's not the same, I realise, but imagine if our church, if we said that anybody can become a Christian, but if you want to be recognised as a church member, a real Christian, you've got to become English as well. You've got to dress English, you've got to act English, you've got to get an English passport, and you've got to take an English citizenship test if you want to be a member of this church. How many of you would have to stop being members? And so they thrashed things out. I wasn't thinking of you, actually. They thrashed things out. We're saved by God's grace, not by our actions, is the summary they come to. And they get this model statement. You don't become a Christian by becoming Jewish. You can become a Christian by coming to Jesus. However, once you become a Christian, we should worship God exclusively, model sexual integrity, and be considerate of other Christians. It's such a simple statement, but it brought unity to the known empire. And so Paul and Barnabas, accompanied by Judas and Silas, they go back to Antioch in Syria, to the church where the false statements and the false teachers are attacked, and they give the verdict. And the verdict is, listen, we've got it in writing now. You don't have to become Jewish to become a Christian. You just have to come to Jesus. Can you imagine those people waiting at Antioch for the verdict? Will we be considered as original Christians? The result of the Jerusalem Council would have a massive impact on Christianity for the next 1,000 years. It'd either divide or unite the church, and it unites the church. And we're told in chapter 15, verse 31, they rejoiced over the encouragement. This is really good news. Unity has been established within the church from Jerusalem, extending all the way to Syria. And the big theme is unity in Jesus. And so Paul and Barnabas and Interestingly, God's obviously in this. Silas decides for some reason to stay in Antioch. He'll be useful later. And the preaching and teaching and building the church up in Antioch. This wonderful unity has been achieved. And there's always a worrying word. What comes next? Then. Verse 36. This wonderful unity, then. It's like a film or a series, isn't it? You have something wonderful happen, everyone's filled with joy, things are going well, then someone says, I want this to last forever, and you know what's going to happen next. We were watching a program, me and Liz, on Friday night, and the couple were saying to each other, well, I'm so happy to spend in the rest of my life with you. I'm so happy to be in this place where I hope it lasts forever. And I said to Liz, you know what's going to happen next, don't you? And it did. A disaster happened. Then usually means then something bad's going to happen. Wonderful unity, then. And the then is a surprise to us because there's a massive fallout. It's really sad and distressing. This irony, after securing unity for the church, unity is lost between Paul and Barnabas. Second thing is the flashpoint. What causes the fallout? We see it from verse 36 through to verse 41. What is it that causes the fallout between Paul and Barnabas? Well, Paul suggests to Barnabas in verse 36, he says we should go back and visit our brothers and sisters in every city where we've preached. We want to see how they're doing. We want to encourage them. We want to tell them about this wonderful verdict that's been reached, that we're all Christians together. That's a great thing to do, isn't it? Again, it's a model for us. Follow up with people. And so Paul and Barnabas, they'd been on this mission trip 2 years earlier. If you remember, we looked at it. They'd sailed to Cyprus. They'd gone through Cyprus preaching the gospel. Then they'd hopped from Cyprus over to what's modern-day Turkey. And they'd worked their way through the mountains in Turkey and back round. And they'd come back to Antioch. And it had been difficult. They'd faced lots of opposition. But together, by God's grace, they stood firm and they had unity. Even when Paul had been beaten up and stoned and left for dead, things worked out. That kind of thing gels you together. It creates a band of brothers, doesn't it, when you've been through something like that? They'd seen lots of people won for Jesus. They'd seen churches established. They'd stayed as long as they could to help and encourage the churches. But eventually, they were either forced or they had to leave. They couldn't stay there forever. And now, Paul says, let's go back. That's great. Let's go back. And Barnabas agrees. Yeah, let's go back. Brilliant. But verse 37, Barnabas is determined to take John Mark with them. And that's the problem. John Mark was Barnabas' nephew. Now, the word for determined means what it says. He was resolute. Barnabas had his mind made up and set. We are taking John Mark. And it causes a problem because just as resolutely as Barnabas says, we are taking John Mark, Paul, we're told, insists that they don't take him. It's a problem, isn't it? Neither of them, Barnabas doesn't suggest that they take John Mark, and Paul doesn't suggest that they don't. Barnabas is determined, his mind's made up, and Paul's insistent, he's not budging. I think we've got to be really careful because he's a great man, but they're probably both at fault there, aren't they? I'm not taking him and I'm not budging. Arguably two of the most godly and prominent men in the New Testament, and they come to a stalemate. Why? Because there's an issue with John Mark. Paul considered John Mark to be a deserter, a bottler. Because on the previous missionary trip they'd made, John Mark had left before they got to Turkey. Things had gotten a little bit, not mega rough, but things had got a little bit rough in Cyprus. And in Paul's eyes, John Mark bailed. When we looked at chapter 13, we speculated about this. John Mark was a genuine believer. He was a good lad, but he couldn't see things through. Maybe he'd romanticized about what being a missionary would be like, and then the reality is he got to the happy Isle of Cyprus and it wasn't so happy. Maybe there was the disappointment of the initial lack of fruit. There were a long trek across Cyprus. There was spiritual battle. There were opposition. Maybe he got homesick. Maybe he got physically sick. And combined with a privileged upbringing, maybe it just proved too much for John Mark. But either way, John Mark bailed. When the going got tough, even in fact before the going got really tough, John Mark bailed. And Paul said, I'm not taking him because he's a deserter. It seems that John Mark was a casualty of mission and serving that we see so much, excited to begin, then gets discouraged, and then deserts when it gets tough. But after he left him, it got even tougher for Paul and Barnabas. John Mark had bailed before the trouble had really started. And what's needed in mission is people who don't bail even when it gets tough. Now, I don't think Paul's someone who was unforgiving. I don't think he's lacking grace, but I'm sure that Paul would have anticipated more trouble on the return. Maybe they'd try to kill him again. Maybe they'd try to run him out of town again. And in Paul's mind, John Mark isn't cut out for that kind of thing. John Mark might compromise the whole mission. I can hear Paul saying, listen, he's a lovely lad, but I need warriors. I need people who are going to be committed because this is dangerous. And again, I speculate, but Barnabas, Mr. Encouragement, John Mark's uncle, says, listen, we need to show grace. We need to remember how God was gracious to you, Paul. You need to show that grace to John Mark. I think this time it'll be different, Paul. And Paul comes back, well, that's fine, maybe for a home mission. But for this mission, I need people with proven character. John Mark's shown himself flaky, I'm not taking him. And Barnabas says, well, if he's not going, I'm not going. And Paul says, well, if he is going, I'm not going. And neither of them will budge. Who was right? Luke doesn't tell us. We'll come back to it later. But we are told the disagreement was so sharp, they split up. This is not, let's agree to disagree. This was, the relationship ended effectively. It's a proper fallout. It was the end of their working relationship. Thirdly, we see the fallout from the fallout, verse 39 to 16, verse 5. The immediate fallout's obvious. Barnabas takes Mark, and he heads off to Cyprus. And Paul takes Silas, and he heads off to Syria and Cilicia and onto Derbe and Lystra. I have done a map. Well, I've copied a map. So, Antioch on the right-hand side, that's where Paul and his new team set off from, and they go up and round, and then all the way back on this next mission trip, come back to Jerusalem. Whereas, I ain't got a picture of this, but Barnabas takes Silas, and they just hop across and go around Cyprus, and then come back. So that they split up, and there's 2 missionary trips instead of 1. It's really sad. We don't hear about Barnabas and Mark's trip. Church history tells us it was successful. Church history tells us that churches were established in Cyprus and Barnabas' name's mentioned a lot. But Luke continues the story with Paul. Paul takes Silas and they end up in Derbe and Lystra. I think Silas had been left to remain because the Lord knew what was going to happen. And so they begin the second missionary trip in reverse. Rather than going to Cyprus first, or rather than going to Patra first, they go the other way. If you remember the last time Paul was in Derbe and Lystra, he escaped by the skin of his teeth after being left for dead. But he didn't leave without there being fruit, because people had been converted. One of the people who had been converted, we mentioned this, but one of the people who were converted in Lystra was a lady called Eunice. Now, Eunice was a Jewish woman who had a Greek husband. And in chapter 16, verse 1, they had a son called Timothy. And he'd become a Christian. Now, he's only a young lad here. Commentators seem to think he was probably somewhere between the ages of 16 and 18. And then he was about 28 when he began his pastoral ministry on his own. Timothy was going to eventually go on to become like a son to Paul. Timothy was going to go on to become one of the great pastors of the New Testament. But here is a 16-year-old kid. And Paul takes him on. That's a bit risky, isn't it? He didn't take John Mark, but he's going to take Timothy. It's a bit risky taking a recently converted teenager on a long and dangerous mission trip. It could end up doing a John Mark. It reminds us, I think, that Paul wasn't cynical. He just didn't think John Mark was up to it. Now, there's a little side here issue we'll deal with, but because Paul's going to go, they're going to go to the synagogues where the Jews are, and they're also going to go to where the non-Jews are. Because Timothy's half Jewish, but not circumcised, Paul gets him circumcised. And we think, well, why has he done that? Haven't they just been to Jerusalem to sort out that you don't need to do that anymore? Well, the issue at Jerusalem was people were saying you had to be Jewish to be a Christian. That's not what's happening here. Paul doesn't want to be a stumbling block. If Timothy's half Jewish, the expectation is he'd be circumcised. And it'd be confusing. It'd caused unnecessary drama. So for the sake of peace, Paul gets him done. Do you see the difference? Paul's not anti-circumcision. He's anti-circumcision as a way of being saved. It's like us saying, we're not anti-law, but we're anti-law as a way of getting right with God. Paul wasn't getting Timothy done to save Timothy, but to break down cultural barriers. I wonder if we'd go that far. It reminds us of this. Where we can, we're to be all things to all people, to take all obstacles away for the gospel. Imagine at this church, imagine that I became pastor, and imagine that I preferred the NIV version of the Bible, or the ESV version of the Bible. And the elders, Jono and Gary, get together and they say, listen, Ben, the preference of the church is the New King James. We don't really like the other versions. Can you preach from the New King James? I'd say, yeah, of course I can. And if ever I did try and change it, I'd be very, very careful, because I'd want to be culturally flexible. But if Gary and Jono come to me and say, you must use the New King James because it's the only version approved by God, and if you use the NIV, people, not even Christians, use that, I think if they said that, I'd change every Bible in the church immediately. Do you see the difference? One's being flexible for the sake of the gospel. The other is when someone makes a non-gospel issue a gospel issue. Paul's being culturally flexible. He's a determined man. He insisted they didn't take Mark, but he's not obstinate. He was flexible. And so they take the newly circumcised Timothy with him, poor Timothy, imagine that at 16, but they take him with them, and then they go around teaching the churches. And they explain the decision made in Jerusalem, and they see the churches strengthened, and they see new people becoming Christians, and the increase in number greatly. We've heard that before in Acts, haven't we? As God's words preach, people get converted. So what's the fallout from Barnabas and Paul's fallout? Gospel success. That's a surprise, isn't it? They fall out, they divide, and they go on to have gospel success, and you've got two successful mission teams rather than one. Does the end justify the means? No. It's a sad division, it's a breakup of fellowship. It's wrong, I think, probably on both sides. But I think we can say, by God's grace, this is God working all things together for good, even division. Jesus will have the nations reached, and even the falling out of the saints won't stop it. Whatever happens, the important thing is that Jesus has the preeminence. So Paul and Barnabas fall out, they go their separate ways. Both are successful for the gospel. That's the narrative. And in the time left, I just want to draw 4 lessons out. 4 things that this teaches us for today. Firstly, there's only one perfect person, and that's Jesus. I think we should be very, very slow to criticise Paul or Barnabas, because I'd happily sit at the feet of both of them even after this event. But it reminds us godly leaders aren't perfect. Church history teaches us the best preachers, the best pastors, the best leaders get things wrong. Luther did, Calvin did, Paul and Barnabas did. We've got to trust and respect our leaders, but we don't put our faith in leaders. We don't put our faith in men, we put our faith in God. You meet people, I bet people, well, I don't want to go to church anymore because somebody hurt me. Well, that's sad, but people do hurt us, don't they? Because only Jesus is perfect. We're not looking to people, we're looking to Jesus for perfection. But I think the worrying thing is that if Paul and Barnabas couldn't stay friends, what hope do we have? But there is another way of looking at it that might encourage us. Campbell Morgan was a great preacher from about 100 years ago. And he said this, he says, I am comforted whenever I read this passage. If I'd never read about their great contention, I'd be afraid. But I realised they were not angels, they were men. The best of men are men at best. That's a comfort, even the best get it wrong. And it's comforting for us when we get it wrong to think, well, better people than me have got it wrong. So there is comfort. They never worked together again, but in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul talks about Barnabas in positive terms. They've obviously mended the relationship. There's no accusation about the relationship even at the beginning. But there's only one perfect person, and that's Jesus. The second lesson is God's work must go on. It's ever so sad when Christians and churches and denominations and leaders fall out. It's always to be regretted. Separation should be an anomaly, but it does happen. The important thing is that God's work goes on. We can worry, this is going to mean this is going to mean this. No, God's work must go on. God buries his workers, not his work. And I think in this instance, God's work goes on with amazing grace in this way, that twice the work gets done. Twice the people get reached. It works out well for the sake of the gospel. It doesn't work out well because they fell out. This is not God blessing a fallout. This is God is committed to his plans. Despite what's happened, verse 5, the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily. It's ever so important when things go wrong, we still glorify, we still love, we still preach Jesus, and we don't drag him into it. God's plans will prosper. Third thing is a lesson of this. How should we handle disagreement and division? You notice what Luke says about this disagreement and division? You notice what he says? Nothing. Why? Because where possible, that's the best thing to do, isn't it? Have you noticed how much space is given later on in the New Testament to delving in to the rights and wrongs of this disagreement? Nothing. Paul and Barnabas had a sharp disagreement, but we don't hear any gossip about it. And so the fire goes out. There's no records of factions, there's no records of splits, there's no records of I am of Paul and I am of Barnabas. Why? Because this was handled properly. It would have caused huge damage to the gospel, wouldn't it? So they don't gossip about it. Now, of course, there are times when things need to be said. Not every disagreement's the same. There's a bloke called Ken Sand, and he's written a famous book called The Peacemaker. And it helps us think through different kinds of disagreements. He describes conflict as falling into mainly 4 categories. And I think these categories escalate in seriousness as they go along. But he says there's one category where it's a different values or different goals or different opinions and priorities. Secondly is misunderstandings. Thirdly, he says, is competition over resource or position. And fourthly, he says, is sinful habits and actions that lead to conflict. There's kind of an increase in seriousness, isn't there? But he puts this in category 1. Paul and Barnabas are in conflict because they've got different opinions. It's sad, it shouldn't have happened, but they don't gossip about one another, they don't slate one another, and neither do the people associated. 2 of the greatest men in history fell out and went their separate ways. We can't gloss over that. But there's no personal attack and there's no rival factions. Because the gospel was too important to them. Who's right? Luke doesn't say, it's just sad. Spirit-filled people can disagree without either of them being more or less filled with the Spirit than the other. Because the best of men are men at best. Fourthly, and finally, it's this. God uses different types of people. Some people are arty. Some people are practical. Some people are 100 miles an hour. Some people are laid back. Some people are organised. Some people are creative. Some people are serious. Some people are jovial. Some people are intellectual. Some people are practical. Which one's right and which one's wrong? Well, none, because God's created us as individuals. We're vastly different. Paul was gracious, of course he was, but he was also incredibly driven. Barnabas was driven, but he was incredibly gracious. Were there times when Paul was too driven? Perhaps. Were there times when Barnabas was too gracious? Perhaps. But God uses different types of people, doesn't he? That's why plurality of elders is good. Which one would you prefer to work alongside? I think I'd probably, just on my character, I'd probably go with Barnabas. Some of you would choose Paul. But you see what this passage is leading to here? Do you see where this passage ends? Jesus is glorified and his kingdom grows. Because in their falling out, they're determined for the gospel to continue, and so are the church. And so instead of having 2 missionaries, Paul and Barnabas, we end up with 5. Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Timothy and John Mark. And they all become a tremendous blessing to the church. Paul, absolute dynamo. Force of nature, a trainer of men, a father figure to pastors. If Paul and Barnabas had remained in partnership, Paul probably wouldn't have took Timothy on board as a trainee, because he'd have had to look after John Mark. You got Barnabas, Mr. Encouragement. He takes John Mark under his wing and he nurses him to fruitfulness. They go to Cyprus, which was less hostile than Turkey. And if Barnabas hadn't taken John Mark, we wouldn't have Mark's gospel. Paul and Barnabas became twice as effective and covered twice the ground. You have John Mark under Barnabas' care. John Mark becomes useful. So we don't write people off, do we? He's later reconciled with Paul. Paul talks later on about how useful John Mark is. And Peter describes John Mark in 1 Peter 5 as a son. John Mark becomes useful. So don't be too hard on John Mark. One writer says, when John Mark left the work, it was because his nerve failed, not his heart. When Demas left, his heart failed. Demas left because he loved this present world. John Mark left because he was scared. There's a difference. But he comes good, so we don't write people off. We get to know Silas in the coming chapters. Silas ended up becoming we don't know why he stayed, but God did, because God had put him there. But Silas became a really loyal, trusted foot soldier for Paul. He's the one who's singing with him in prison. He becomes Paul's lifelong companion in the gospel. He becomes Paul's stenographer. That means he transcribed Paul's letters, particularly Thessalonians. Silas was a Roman citizen, so he had access that Barnabas didn't have. Barnabas was a massive loss, but Silas is a huge gain. Then you have Timothy, young Timothy. Think of the education he got from travelling with Paul and Silas. If it hadn't been for this fallout, Timothy probably wouldn't have been taken. It'd have remained just untapped potential. God's in the details, isn't he? Things happen in life and we wonder, and in the coincidences, God's not flummoxed because he hasn't got a plan B, just a plan A. Timothy could bridge cultures. Timothy had a massive pastoral heart and gifts. Think about how many men did Timothy train for ministry? We don't know. We'll only find out in heaven, but it's because of this. The churches were strengthened and increased in numbers daily. Why? Because Paul and Barnabas fell out? No, because Jesus had said that he'll build his church. Jesus had said, I will have my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and even to the ends of the earth. And he'll even use division for that. Division's sad, we seek to avoid it. Only Jesus is perfect. But God's work is bigger than any person or any character, and it will go on. Where there's disagreement that can be fixed, fix it. But avoid factions and gossip. And remember, God uses different types of people. Dynamos, encouragers, people who've previously lost the way, loyal people, intellectual people, people with a pastoral heart. It's a reminder for us to make sure we put aside personal issues for the sake of Jesus. I want us to close by saying the words together that Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus while he was in prison. And he was calling them to use their gifts together for the sake of the gospel. We'll put it up on the screen. Maybe we could read it together. Let's stand, because we'll stay standing after this to sing. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long-suffering, bearing with one another in love, endeavouring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. Amen. Let's remain standing and sing.